My name is Ivo Ganchev, and I'm Adjunct Professor of Global Leadership at Beijing Union University. Today, I want to talk to you about tariffs, and specifically, I want to elaborate on the effect that tariffs have on international trade. What I'll give you is a theoretical perspective, so it will be modeled based on a number of assumptions following on my previous talk on the benefits of international free trade. So if you haven't seen that, you can first go to that talk and have a look at it first. So, first of all, let's start with the definition of a tariff. So what is a tariff? It's a tax on imports and exports between sovereign states. It's a form of regulation of foreign trade and a policy that taxes foreign products to encourage or safeguard domestic industry. So for instance, if you are importing, for example, roses, you could impose a tariff on roses to make them more expensive in order to help your domestic producers to be more competitive on the market and to encourage them to produce more roses. Apart from tariffs, there are also other ways of controlling policy in terms of trade. You can have tools such as quotas or non-tariff barriers. So quotas, for instance, would limit the absolute quantity of a product that could be imported from other producers. Non-tariff barriers would be regulations that control the quality of certain products or the specific features that you're looking for in terms of products that you're importing. But today we're going to focus mainly on tariffs because we want to model them economically and we also want to learn more about their implications. So first of all, to get you started, you need to think about a country that's producing coffee. So if you saw my previous talk, that would be Brazil. And when you think about Brazil, you need to understand its coffee market and you need to understand how much coffee is being produced there and what's the price of coffee per kilogram. So let's imagine that the market looks like this graph. So to understand this graph, first you need to look at its features. So the red line here indicates the level of domestic supply, which would increase as the price increases. So the higher the price, the more willing your domestic producers would be to make more coffee because they're making more money. They're taking more money for it. And then you have the demand curve, which is the blue line here on the figure, and it's essentially the opposite of the supply curve. So the lower the price, the more willing people are to buy more of the coffee. So where the demand and the supply curve meet is this point A right here, which determines the quantity or kilograms of coffee produced domestically and also determines the price level at which the market will be able to consume what is being produced. Now, apart from that, you also have two other features on the graph, which are termed consumer surplus and producer surplus. So consumer surplus is essentially the benefit for consumers in this type of situation on the market. So a consumer surplus means that there was a certain number of people, so there was a certain level of demand that would have actually been there even if the price was higher. So to give you an example, let's say you want to go and buy a pair of shoes, right? You go to the mall and you look for shoes and you've brought with yourself, say, $200, right? But you see a great pair of shoes that's only $100. You go ahead, you buy it, and the consumer surplus for you is the other $100. So the consumer surplus is the money that you did not spend on that day, because this is money that you were prepared to spend but did not have to. And then you also have the producer surplus. So this is essentially the opposite of the consumer surplus. These are the gains that producers have in their mind from producing a certain number of kilograms of coffee. So they would be producing even if the price was lower, and if they were producing lesser quantities, they would actually be willing to sell them at a smaller price. So some of the producers would be thinking, well, I would have actually sold this coffee even if it was cheaper, but I'm still selling it today at a higher price and I'm making more than I expected. This is what we call the producer surplus. Now, this type of market arrangement here is a theoretical model under autarky. And if you remember our previous talk, autarky means a state of the market where there is no free trade. So this is just the situation being examined domestically. Now, let's see what happens if you introduce imports into the coffee market. So essentially, the shift that takes place here is you move from the domestic supply into a curve of world supply. So the supply curve now moves from the purple line to the blue line. And now it starts to intersect with the demand curve at another point on the graph. So you move from point A to this point right here, which you could term, for instance, B. And this means that now there is more coffee on the market and it is being sold to at a lower price. So you can see at the bottom right here that the quantity has moved up, and you can see right here on the price kind of axis here that the price has gone down. So what does this mean? Well, there are different gains and losses for different players in the market here. So if you think about, for instance, consumers are going to be much happier. Why? Because the price of the coffee has gone down. If you think about producers, well, domestic producers might not be as happy because now the amount of coffee that is being produced domestically is going to be less because some of the coffee is going to be imported from places that make cheaper coffee. So let's look at the impact of imports on consumer and producer surplus. So if you look at consumer surplus, now we have X plus Z. So initially you had a consumer surplus of W, which was there regardless of the import. So this was the initial consumer surplus right here. And what happened was, as the price dropped, now you have all of this money that some consumers were actually prepared to spend, but they are not going to spend it because the price has gone down. And what you have here also in terms of a loss is a loss for the producers. So there are producers that are actually actually going to be making more money if trade was not introduced, but they are not. So essentially, the total change here is the addition of Z in terms of surplus. Why? Well, because the consumer surplus is actually X plus Z, and X is something that producers also lost. So the net change here is actually Z, and the overall change is in the benefit of the consumers. But now let's think about it in terms of trade and tariffs. So let's think about what happens if you introduce tariffs. Well, the first thing that happens is the product becomes more expensive. So right here, you can see how the price is going to move up on the graph. And when the price goes up, the quantity is going to move down. So now we are at a point where we're moving from these points here from PT to PTA, and now you're moving from QT to QTA. Now, this is the new point here on the graph where demand and supply were supposed to intersect after the price went up. But here's the thing. Out of this new price, there are different players in the market. So for instance, there is the government that is taking a part of this tariff, right? So you need to consider what's happening for the producers, what's happening for the consumers, and what's happening for the government in terms of trade. And it's exemplified in that table right here. So first of all, the consumer surplus is going to decrease by A plus B plus C plus D. Why? Well, because all of these four figures right here before that were a part of the consumer surplus, and because the goods became more expensive. Now the producer surplus is going to increase by A because we have this amount of new product that domestic producers can allow themselves to produce while still selling it for a price that is actually reasonable for them. But you also have to consider that from the imports that are coming in, the government is going to be taking some revenue. So the government is going to be taking, for instance, this amount of revenue here in the green square, which we have labeled C, and this is also a positive change in the overall surplus. However, the two remaining parts, which are the two triangles B and D, were before in the consumer surplus, but now they are not in the consumer surplus and they are not in the producer surplus anymore. So they are a net loss to the welfare of society. So essentially what happens is you have a negative total change in surplus of minus B and essentially minus D. So tariffs benefit the domestic producers in some way, they benefit the government in terms of revenue in some way, but they make the consumers, the end users, worse off. So based on what we talked about today, here are some follow-up questions that you need to consider in terms of tariffs. So first of all, where do you stand on tariffs? There are tremendous debates in policy circles and in academic circles in terms of how much tariffs we should put into place, which products we should put tariffs on, which products should be traded freely. So do some of your own research, look at the current tariffs that are imposed on different products from different countries, and think about it for yourself. Which products do you think should have tariffs? Which products do you think should be traded freely, and why so? I hope that you can do some of your own research and learn more about the topic. I'll talk to you next time.